Progress.
Good morning. Today we are going to discuss about the cranial nerves. So, for peripheral nerves of the human body, we have two types. One is those crane nerves which come from the spinal cord, which we call as spinal nerves, and then we have those peripheral nerves which come or arise from the brain directly, and those we call as cranial. In the body, we have 12 cranial nerves, 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So this is having some similarities with the spinal nerve, but there are also differences with this cranial nerves when we compare it to the spinal nerves. One difference would be that it is having not all cranial nerves are mixed. That means not all the cranial nerves will have both motor and sensory. Whereas if you look into spinal nerves, all the peripheral spinal nerves are mixed nerves. That is, they carry both sensory fibers and motor fibers. But in the cranial nerves, it is not like that for all the cranial nerves, whereas some are only sensory, some are purely motor, and few cranial nerves are mixed, having both. So that is a very important thing to keep in mind. So before we go into the individual 12 cranial nerves, it is important to understand how they function. So as I just mentioned, not all are mixed, and also in the particular function, even if it is sensory or motor nerve, it will function according to the functional component that it is affiliated or connected with. Now, these functional components are seen in the brainstem. So, that is a very important uh, thing to understand. So, when we think about cranial nerves, the most important thing to understand is among 12 pairs, 10 pairs are attached to the brainstem. 10 pairs of the cranial nerves, that is from cranial nerve number 3 to 12. These are having attachments or its functional components are in the brainstem. So that leaves only the first and second cranial nerve, and these are attached directly to the forebrain part. So that is a important thing to understand. So olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve, second cranial nerve, optic, these both two cranial nerves are attached to the uh, forebrain. Now, in the rest of the 10, we can see that the midbrain will have attachment of two cranial nerves, that is the third and the fourth, and the pons will have attachment to the fifth cranial nerve, trigeminal, sixth abducens, seventh facial, and also some of the nuclei of the vestibulocochlear, that is, it is also seen in the pons. And that leaves the remaining uh, four, that would be the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, the accessory, and hypoglossal nerve. These will have their functional components in the medulla oblongata. And when we will see about the 11th cranial nerve, we will also see it has got nuclei in the spinal cord also, so that we can see later. So this is the overall view of where the functional components are located. Now, when we see the development of the central nervous system, we can see even in the case of the spinal cord and the same when you come to the brainstem, we see that it is developing from two plates. One is alar plate and basal plate. So that is how we got the sensory and motor components in the central nervous system. And dividing between the motor and the sensory is a sulcus we call as, or a depression or a limitation, which we call a sulcus limitans. or that is separating the alar plate from the basal plate, as we can see in this diagram. This indentation that we see here on either side, right and left, that would be the sulcus limitans. And on both side of it, we can see there is alar plate and basal plate. So that is how all the functional components appear in the brainstem. So we will see that in the brainstem, medially, we can see that we have the motor components, and laterally we will see the placing of the sensory components. So this is because of the development of the basal and alar plate, which was separated by the sulcus limitans, and the same structure is what we see in the spinal cord also, separating the motor and sensory components. Now, functionally, that we can say there are totally around 7 functional components, and they, as I said, we can say from medial to lateral. If we see it in an arrangement, it would be first the motor components, which are the general somatic efferent, then the general visceral efferent, and then the special visceral efferent, and the sulcus limitans. And further lateral to the sulcus limitans will be the general visceral afferent and special visceral afferent, which is also kind of together very close to the general visceral afferent. And then comes the general somatic afferent, and most laterally will be the special sense or special somatic afferent. So this is how the 7 functional components are arranged in the brainstem. So it is to these functional components that we will see the cranial nerves being connected to. So depending on which functional components it is connected to, that will be the distribution of that cranial nerve. So we have to understand a cranial nerve can be attached to more than one functional components. So that is depending upon what area it is supplying or taking sensation from. So, as we just saw before, this is how in the brainstem the functional components are located. Of course, in both the sides, we can see that the general somatic efferent is related with somatic muscles. So we can see the extraocular muscles, the tongue muscles. These are all some of those muscles which are being controlled by the general somatic efferent nuclei. Then, when we talk about the general visceral efferent muscles, those are parasympathetic controlled muscles. So, like the Edinger-Westphal nuclei, which is carrying through the third cranial nerve to your muscles in the eyeball. Then the salivatory nuclei, which is being carried by the seventh and the ninth cranial nerves to the salivary glands, then the dorsal nucleus of the vagus nerve. So these are some of the examples that we see which are being supplied by the general visceral efferent. So it is all depending on what function the component is. Those fibers will only supply to that muscles or structures. When we talk about muscles coming from the special visceral efferent, they are also called as branchiomotor because they are those muscles which are developed from the branchial arches or the pharyngeal apparatus. So, example, those muscles of mastication, then facial expression muscles, pharyngeal muscles, laryngeal muscles, the neck muscle, like trapezius, sternocleidomastoid. These are some of the examples of the branchiomotor component supplied muscles. So this is what determines what distribution each cranial nerve does. When we come to the sensory, the special senses, of course. So we know there is a hearing and balance carried by the eighth cranial nerve. Then the general sensation, which is carried by the trigeminal nerve. Then the special sense of taste. So special visceral afferent, the special sense of the taste connected to nucleus tractus solitarius and the gustatory nucleus. these will be connected as the special visceral afferent. Then the general visceral afferent, which are taking sensory sensations of the pain from the viscera. So they will also could be carried by nucleus tractus. And so depending on the what function the nerve is being. So this is also a depiction of how the cranial nerves nuclei or these functional components are situated in either side of the brain stem. So of course, in this diagram, one side is showing sensory and the other is showing the motor. But obviously, yes, both are seen in both the halves. So just for the sake of space, one side is in the diagram is showing the sensory, and whereas the other half is of the diagram shows the motor components. So we can understand it is scattered in the midbrain, the pons, and also in the medulla. So this is how the why the cranial nerves is distributed in its attachment. So today let's begin with the olfactory nerve. As the name suggests, it has got to do everything with the special sensation of smell. So it is totally sensory nerve or a purely a sensory nerve, and its functional component is special somatic afferent. So this is the nerve which is connected to the olfactory epithelium, and that olfactory epithelium is what we have seen lining on the roof of the nasal cavity. So just like in pathways of tracks, here also the first order neurons will be coming from the receptor cells which are located in the olfactory bulb. So the receptors are obviously having filaments, and that filaments is what passes through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid through and into the olfactory epithelium. So from the bulb, olfactory bulb, which is lying above the bone or above the ethmoid cribriform, through the pores, the filaments will come to the mucosa or the olfactory epithelium with which is seen on the roof of the nasal cavity, which will have the receptor cells. So from the receptor cells, the first order neurons will carry the sensations into the olfactory bulb, from which then the olfactory nerve or the tract is beginning or continuing. So olfactory receptors, they are having these cilia, which are attached with the receptor nerve endings, and there of course they take the special sensations of the smell or the pheromones. So from there the nerve endings will take the sensation of the smell, and it will carry the sensation to the olfactory bulb. So the first order of neurons is bipolar, and you can see here the shorter nerve endings are coming to the surface, and the long axon is going upwards to the olfactory bulb, where then it is synapsed with the connections there. So this is how the olfactory nerve begins. And then, of course, from the olfactory bulb, it is continued as a tract, rather called as a tract, rather than just a olfactory nerve. It is a tract. Okay, so we're not going into the complexities of the functioning, but we can understand from the olfactory bulb, it is continued as olfactory tract, which will then split into two groups of fibers. One will be the lateral and one will be the medial stria. And from there, it will carry to the primary olfactory functional cortex, which is in the temporal lobe and or close to the temporal pole, and which we can say as the uncus and the anterior perforated substance. So this is the nearest relation for the primary olfactory cortex. So this is how, as I said, comes from the olfactory bulb. The olfactory tract divides into two strias, one which is going medially to the anterior perforated, and the lateral stria which is going towards the Lyman insulae, and from there it is projected to this uh, olfactory cortex, which we see here. This is the uncus at the temporal pole, and just close or anterior to that is the olfactory cortex. So that is the ending of where the olfactory tract comes, carrying the sensations of the smell. So this is how the olfactory nerve functions, and therefore we have an overview now of how the pathway or the olfactory nerve functions from the receptors to the olfactory bulb, and then from the olfactory bulb, the olfactory tract, which is divided into two strias, lateral and medial, and it will go to corresponding areas through the also the limbic system. That is why when we say about the smell, we always have memories of smell because it is connected. There is a pathway, there is also a collateral which is going to the limbic system, and therefore the limbic system gives us memories of those smells which we have already had before. So it will easily be able to connect and give an interpretation to what that smell could be or would be. So that is the very great functioning of the olfactory centers, and of course the olfactory nerve, which is very elementary for the function. So this is the highlight or the importance of olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve. Applied aspect, we can say, are meningiomas or connected to the olfactory bulb. So this is the olfactory bulb. You can see there is a meningioma here. So this is compressing on the brain, and so similar kind of applied aspects can also be mentioned. So just to summarize about the olfactory nerve, once again, starting from the olfactory receptors, which are seen on the roof of the nasal cavity, and passing the filaments, which are otherwise the olfactory nerve filaments, which ends up in the olfactory bulb, sitting on top of the cribriform plate of ethmoid. From there, the olfactory tract begins and dividing into two strias, medial and lateral. Some of it is connected to the limbic system, some of it will directly go to the olfactory cortex. So this is a summary of the cranial nerve number one. I hope